We introduced training, reviewed all our processes and procedures. We started looking at the partnerships that we had and could we improve that training with specialised training. We looked at the accessibility of our business, so how people interact with us, and we started to introduce over the years different new ways to make ourselves more accessible, foreign language translation services to our Recite Me toolbar, which can translate and do a lot of different things for people.
You are listening to the Consumers and Standards series from the BSI Education Podcast in association with CPIN, the Consumer and Public Interest Network. Today's episode is on standards and consumer vulnerability.
We started with initial things with processes and procedures, and then over the years we've just continually improved and improving, adding new things. So it's really good, we've been shown in the standard to say that we're actually moving away from that engineering focus and we're becoming more customer focused, and they've seen that improving year on year, which is amazing.
The voice you heard at the top of the episode there was Julie Walker from Scottish and Southern Electricity Networks, talking about the positive impact on her organisation and their customers of adopting the standard BS 18477 for inclusive service provision. We'll hear more from Julie later, and also from CPIN Chair Julie Hunter, Martin Coppack from the organisation Fair by Design, and Caroline Lewis from the consultancy firm Access Design Solutions. Hello, my name is Matthew Childs, and you are listening to the third episode of the BSI Education Podcast Consumers and Standards series, which is about standards and consumer vulnerability. And we are delighted to be bringing it to you in association with our friends at CPIN, the independent Consumer and Public Interest Network, which in 2021 is celebrating its 70th anniversary.
The Consumer and Public Interest Network, or CPIN, empowers and protects consumers, making everyone's lives safer, fairer, and better through effective consumer representation in British standards. Established in 1951, CPIN's trained volunteers participate in the development of standards to highlight key consumer issues, making sure that real-life problems are addressed and the risk of consumer harm is minimized. CPIN believes that all consumers have a right to safe and accessible goods and services, clear information, fair treatment, effective systems of redress, and a healthy environment. CPIN representatives use the United Nations Guidelines for Consumer Protection as the foundation of their work. They sit on hundreds of standards development committees, speaking up for consumers. To find out more, visit bsigroup.com/consumers.
The consumer voice in standards is incredibly important. This is because standards are everywhere, making consumers' lives safer, fairer, and easier. Whether you're using a mobile phone or shopping online, standards behind the scenes are setting good practice for organisations that make goods and provide services. Now, BSI publishes around 2,500 standards every year, and it'd be pretty much impossible for CPIN to get involved in every single one. So instead, resources are focused in areas where CPIN can have the greatest positive impact for consumers, based on 5 priorities: sustainability, consumer vulnerability, consumer safety, digital, and services. Now, the aim of the BSI Education Podcast is to bring you the stories behind the standards. So this series looks at some of the stories and issues for each of these 5 priorities. So for this episode, the CPIN priority is consumer vulnerability.
Vulnerability has risen up the consumer protection agenda in recent years. At an international level, the United Nations considers the understanding of consumer vulnerability to be central to delivering effective and inclusive legislation, enforcement, and redress. The UN Guidelines for Consumer Protection, revised in 2015, cite the protection of vulnerable and disadvantaged consumers as a key principle to be considered by governments, policymakers, and businesses. CPIN believes that goods and services should be fair and inclusive, and that organizations provide the right support for those in vulnerable situations.
Here's me with a quick reminder that for more information on BSI education, go to bsigroup.com/education. This link and others on the themes raised in this episode can be found in the episode notes. Do please rate and review us wherever you get your podcasts, and share us on social media using the hashtag BSIEdPod. And if you have any comments or questions about this episode or ideas for future episodes, then do please get in touch at education@bsigroup.com. We really welcome your feedback. This episode looks at how CPIN and standards play a vital role in the area of consumer vulnerability, with 4 guests. Caroline Lewis is a director of consultancy firm Access Design Solutions and also a CPIN representative. Martin Coppack is a director at Fair by Design, an organisation dedicated to ending the poverty premium. Julie Walker is Social Obligations and Vulnerability Services Delivery Manager at Scottish and Southern Electricity Networks. But we start with Julie Hunter, independent consultant, writer and researcher specialising in consumer issues, and also CPIN Chair. I started by asking Julie, why has consumer vulnerability risen up the consumer protection agenda in recent years?
I think vulnerability has always existed, of course. But I think a lot of it's to do with consumer demand, and that has kind of led to changes in consumer protection. So UK consumers started off wanting good value from service providers. Then they wanted better customer service. So I think then companies have had to up their game to compete with that in a more demanding marketplace. But then consumers have started thinking, how can organisations go above and beyond, what they're doing already? How can they go above that good service? And in the digital age, we're really we're more aware of what companies are doing. We've got the internet, we've got social media. We hear about case studies of consumer harm. We hear about reports and surveys of who's doing well and who's not performing so well. And I think consumer groups have started thinking maybe 10, 15 years ago much more about ethical issues and the consumer harm that could come about as a result. So things like social responsibility, equality, fairness, and how organisations were treating consumers in vulnerable circumstances, because consumer groups could see the huge potential there was for consumer harm. And I think also it's something that all consumers can relate to, because they've either been in a vulnerable situation themselves or they know a family member or a friend, and it's quickly become very important to consumers, and good businesses are responding to that. And that's been reflected in standards and legislation and regulation as well. So about a decade ago, I think it was 2010, we published BS 18477 Inclusive Service. And that was a really groundbreaking standard, because it was the first time that all these principles or concepts have been put down really in writing. And then 2015, you had the United Nations Guidelines for Consumer Protection. And for the first time, they recognised that inclusivity was one of the 11 legitimate consumer needs. And that's around the protection of vulnerable and disadvantaged consumers. And the United Nations guidelines, they're international guidance that's used by governments and businesses around the world. So that was a really important step forward, I think, in putting these things down on paper. And just one thing that I realised when I started working on the global standard, ISO 22458, was we have a really strong consumer protection framework in the UK when it comes to protecting consumers in vulnerable circumstances, Consumer Rights Act, Equality Act. We have lots of regulators who've published guidance on fair treatment of vulnerable consumers. But loads of countries around the world don't have consumer protection legislation or equality legislation at all. They don't have regulators. In some countries, they don't even recognise the term vulnerability. They don't use it in legislation. It might not even be in consumers' vocabulary. So that's why I think the international standard has been really important, because this isn't a globally recognised concept. So it shows what a valuable tool the standard can be.
Now, I'm glad you mentioned ISO 22458, because I want to come back to that specifically later on. But before we do that, I'm interested in the factors that may contribute to consumer vulnerability. What are they?
Yeah, that's a good question, because there are so many of these risk factors. And what's really important is the concept of vulnerability has moved on a lot in the last 10 years. So if you're thinking 10, 15 years ago, people were really only thinking about stereotypical groups of people being vulnerable. So people over a certain age, or people with a disability, for example. And that is still the way that vulnerability is thought of in lots of countries. But now, thankfully, the concept has moved on a lot, and there's really wide range of factors at play. And a lot of them are situational. So things like personal life events, for example, if you suffer a bereavement or a relationship breakdown, you lose your job, your income drops, you're in debt, maybe you're a victim of domestic abuse. These are all personal life events that can really, really impact vulnerability. In the standard, we also look at health issues, so mental health, dementia, which we know is affecting, so many consumers now. We're becoming much more aware of that. People living with severe illness, terminal illness. We also look at skills and capabilities. So language skills, for example, if you're living in a country where you don't, that language is not your first language, people's numeracy skills can affect how they interact with financial service providers. And also things like digital capability, how good are you at navigating the internet, for example? That's a big factor too. And just the final one, which is really important, is external conditions. So that's things like that you don't really have control over, like the behaviour of organisations, how well they manage customer service or complaints process, things like people from other countries actually made us more aware of things like natural disasters like earthquakes, floods, extreme weather events. And all of us working on the standard over the last 2 years, obviously things like pandemics, that's a big external factor that could make very large numbers of people vulnerable. So it was really interesting to see how the range of risk factors has really expanded over recent years. And we have a much greater understanding now of all the things that can contribute to vulnerability.
Now, you mentioned a global pandemic. I was going to ask you about COVID. I mean, how has COVID amplified the issues surrounding consumer vulnerability?
It's had a really big impact. COVID and the resulting restrictions have affected everyone's lives, I think, in a number of different ways. So it's created new vulnerabilities, but it's also made existing vulnerabilities worse. So, for example, if you think about being in lockdown, working from home, that's kind of isolated people socially, maybe separated them from family and friends. That's taken its toll on people's mental health. If you already had mental health issues, it could have made the situation worse. Financially, some people have been better off during COVID. They've been earning the same but spending less, but many, many people have been struggling financially. So reduced working hours, loss of income, or maybe even losing their jobs altogether. So for people who are already struggling to make ends meet before the pandemic, obviously this has put them in a much more vulnerable situation. And I think another thing is COVID has forced people to move online for a lot of things. You're carrying out lots more activities online, like shopping, banking. And there's lots of people who had never shopped online before or aren't that tech savvy. And they're having to go online to do their shopping. And that's a big risk factor for vulnerability. I mean, lack of knowledge and experience is a risk factor, whether it's technical skills online or, for example, even if you know nothing about cars or washing machines and computers, and you have to place your trust in the mechanic or the engineer who diagnoses the problem, you're instantly in a vulnerable situation because they know more than you do. So I think there's so many examples where COVID has made existing vulnerabilities worse. And yes, impacted a lot of people.
Now, earlier you mentioned ISO 22458. Now, could you tell us why this particular standard is important and how could it help to improve outcomes for vulnerable consumers?
Well, as I mentioned before, lots of countries lack any legislation or regulation in this area to protect consumers in vulnerable situations. So it's really, really important that guidance is there because it's global. It makes sure there's a consistency of approach across all different nations, cultures, because there's lots of cultural differences as well that we need to consider when making the standard, but also across lots of service sectors. So it's been really good to have, we've had 16 countries involved, all bringing their own experiences, and we can put together from those experiences what the good practice is. It makes us think of lots of different things. So I think that the standard is going to help because it gives really detailed requirements and recommendations for organisations and a checklist of what they need to do to consider, what things they need to consider to identify and support consumers who may be vulnerable, how to treat them fairly, and how to minimise that risk of harm. So I'll just give a few examples of things that are in the standard that I think are going to help. We focus quite a lot on inclusive design, listening to lived experiences, understanding consumers and the vulnerabilities that may exist, making sure that services are usable and accessible to the greatest number of people possible, how to spot the risk factors for vulnerability, whether it's through staff observation, encouraging disclosure to understand the difficulties. And something really important is for firms to focus on what is it that consumers are vulnerable to? What is the impact on the individual and the difficulties they're experiencing, rather than the cause of the vulnerability? We also cover things like how to record personal information while protecting privacy, and how to give the best response. We give suggestions of what service providers can do to help support individuals and minimise that risk of harm. So I think if businesses use this standard, it's going to really help improve the quality of their interactions with their customers. It's going to hopefully help them to reduce the likelihood of problems and complaints because they're going to get things right first time. And it's going to help, enhance their reputation because they're doing the right thing. So it can also help them enhance their legal obligations to meet, in terms of fairness and equality. It can help them make sure that they're following that good practice in the way that they treat consumers in vulnerable situations. So hopefully it's going to have a really positive impact on consumers in a wide range of vulnerable circumstances globally.
And at what point are we at in the development of this particular standard? Okay,
so the draft at the moment is out for public comment until the 23rd of June, and we are hoping that we'll be publishing in March 2022.
And you can find a link to that draft standard for public consultation in the episode notes.
Did you know? Living with dementia.
The word dementia refers to a group of symptoms affecting memory, thinking, reasoning, language and judgment that deteriorate over time. Dementia affects around 850,000 people in the UK. By 2025, this number will have reached 1 million. As the number of people with dementia increases, it's important that their local communities understand and support their needs. The standard PAS 1365 helps to ensure that communities are more aware of the needs of those with dementia and how to help them, as well as enabling them to live better lives in their community. In my conversation with Julie Hunter, she mentioned the standard BS 18477 on inclusive service provision. I picked this up with the other Julie in this episode, Julie Walker of Scottish and Southern Electricity Networks. As we heard at the top of the episode, her company's been using this standard. Like Julie Hunter, Julie Walker is also involved in the development of the new standard for consumer vulnerability, ISO 22458. I started by asking Julie about why the issue of consumer vulnerability is so important for her organisation.
So consumer vulnerability is important for our organisation because we're providing a vital supply to customers. So they're relying on energy. And it's amazing how an impact of not having any power can affect people's well-being. So it's really important to us that we understand the different customers that are across different demographics of our organisation and the impacts that a power cut can have on these kind of people so that we can ensure that the services that we're offering are fit for purpose, that if they have a power cut, we can react quickly, we can provide the support they need. And proactively, we do a lot of work engaging with our customers, our communities. We have a lot of partnerships in place just so that we can deepen that understanding of the different people, that different vulnerable groups that we have, from communication difficulties, disabilities, and even people in fuel poverty, so that we can ensure that we provide a service that, that can benefit them.
Now, on the podcast, Julie, we love to talk about journeys, standards journeys, and we tend to talk about them in terms of individuals. But I'm interested in the consumer vulnerability journey for you and your organisation.
Well, actually, the British Standard BS 18477 had a really positive impact for us. So we started that journey about 7 years ago, and we were generally really kind of an engineering focused business, and obviously vulnerability was kind of a buzzword back then, and it was becoming more of a focus. So we looked at the standard, and actually as part of that, taking on that standard, we did a lot of gap analysis just to make sure that we were prepared for going through the process and achieving that. So for us, it was really important that we changed and improved a lot of things so that we could, adhere to that standard.
And you're now certified to BS 18477?
Yeah, we've been certified for 6 consecutive years now. Yep, so it's really good, and hopefully that will continue for the future years coming.
Now, what would you say are sort of the main changes that have taken place within the organisation because of you implementing BS 18477?
Well, I mean, that's all part of the journey. I mean, we've changed the initial changes when we did that gap analysis, and using the matrix of the standard was really good to help us do that. We introduced training. We had reviewed all our processes and procedures. We started looking at the partnerships that we had, and could we improve that training with specialized training. We looked at the accessibility of our business, so how people interact with us, and we started to introduce over the years different new ways to make ourselves more accessible, foreign language translation services to our Recite Me toolbar, which can translate and do a lot of different things for people, which is really good. So we started with initial things with processes and procedures, and then over the years we've just continually improved and improving, adding new things. So it's really good, and we've been shown in the standard to say that we're actually moving away from that engineering focus, and we're becoming more customer focused, and they've seen that improving year on year, which is amazing.
Well, that's a really interesting journey, and I wonder how has the experience with that particular standard, BS 18477, how has that influenced the way your organisation views and uses other standards?
To be honest, I think that was fairly new for us when we looked at the BS 18477. And since then, we have looked at a couple of other standards, such as the customer service and the resilience standard. And we still are kind of looking at those. So it has opened our eyes to see that there are other standards that we could achieve. We've just not started on those new journeys yet.
And how about your personal involvement? I'm interested about your personal involvement with BSI and CPIN and standards generally. I mean, how important is it for you and your organisation that you're involved in standards making?
Oh, it's for me personally, it's helped me become more confident. It was really a real eye-opener listening to all the other people that are part of that working group from across the globe, helping you to understand that I think we get stuck in what happens in the UK and our own legislation and our own challenges. And it really opens your eyes hearing what other countries' challenges are, different legislation, and obviously through working along the standard, it has to be adapted to so that it's, everyone can use it. So it really has kind of given me more knowledge of vulnerability in lots of different areas, so which is really good. And the company, they're just really proud that we're a part of that we're seen as being an expert on that group. And actually, we can take that out and engage with others across the industry and lead that, which is really good. So the standard, which is the international standard, I've forgotten it. God, I've just lost my thought now.
ISO 22458.
Oh, did you take outs afterwards as well?
No, there's only 90,000 standards to remember, and I'm a bit disappointed you've forgotten the first one. But there we go.
I couldn't remember whether, because we call it WD, you see, and I was like ISO WD. I went, oh my god, and then I just had a mind blank. So right, let me start that again. So the ISO 22458 international standard is in draft version now and is out for public review. So people out in the public domain and businesses can comment, and we will collate those comments and we will make any amendments that we need to do, and then hopefully that will be ready for publication early next year.
And what would you say, Julie, finally, anyone who is thinking maybe about taking part in standards making, what would you say to them?
I would say, from the experience that we've been through and experiences that I know other businesses have had, British Standard it really helped change and shape our business. So in going through the journey that we have over the last 6-7 years, from gap analysis to making improvements, it's had a massive change in our culture, in our behaviours, because we're obviously trying to demonstrate that we're attuned to that standard. It's not just about ticking the boxes and saying, yes, we're doing X, Y, and Z. In doing those things and changing what we have in our business, we've had people come back to us saying it's changed behaviours, it's people are more positive, people are more empowered. So it's had a really good effect on us. So I would definitely recommend it to any business who is thinking about doing a standard.
Did you know? Button batteries.
With recent developments in product design and technology, batteries are now available in a wide range of consumer products, including those aimed at children. Developed in collaboration with the Child Accident Prevention Trust, the Royal Society for the Prevention of Accidents, and the European Safety Federation, the standard PAS 7055 is an important step towards addressing the safety issues posed by batteries. It defines the safety requirements for manufacturers and producers of button and coin batteries, including the consumer products that use them, and the retailers who sell them. We continue our look at the issue of standards and consumer vulnerability, this time from the perspective of those on low incomes, with Martin Coppack, a director of the organisation Fair by Design. Martin was previously Deputy Chief Executive at the Lending Standards Board, and prior to that, he was Head of Partnerships at the Financial Conduct Authority. With a background in consumer advocacy, grant making and regulation, Martin has held a range of positions, all with a common objective: to place low-income and vulnerable people at the heart of policy making. I started by asking Martin to tell me about Fair by Design.
So I'm Director of Fair by Design, and we exist to eliminate the poverty premium. So those are the extra costs that poorer people pay for essential services. So things like your energy, your insurance and credit. And examples of the poverty premium include things like prepayment meters for your energy. So you're paying in advance, but more costly for your energy upfront. Not being on the best energy tariff because you don't necessarily have the time and ability to search out the best tariff for you. It could also include high cost credit and also insurance. So an example there being, if you live in an area which is deemed to be higher risk, you pay a lot more money for your insurance.
Now, Martin, on the podcast, we have a running feature, which is all about our guest standards journeys. So I'll ask you as well, where did standards start for you and where are you now?
Actually, it started in school when I was studying for my A-level home economics. So that's way back. I'm not even sure whether they teach A-level home economics anymore.
I did a home economics, not at A level, but I remember that term, home economics. You've suddenly sent a shiver down my spine.
But I actually then did a degree in home ec, although it changed its name halfway through the course. So I took it to a whole new level. For me, standards are around a certain level of quality, showing a certain level of quality. So big links here between safety for consumers, but also knowing that a product or service will be fit for purpose. Especially if it's designed around inclusivity with users. I guess I've been working in consumer advocacy for almost all of my professional life. So standards have come in and out of my professional work for many years. I'm a particular fan of your earlier standard around consumer vulnerability. And I used that a lot when I worked at the financial regulator, when I was helping the regulator and firms get their heads around what does consumer vulnerability mean and how can we address the needs of vulnerable consumers. And I suppose I've been involved every now and again with BSI itself in terms of helping to represent consumer interests in standards.
Now, earlier in the podcast, we heard from Julie Hunter. She was talking about the forthcoming ISO 22458. Which talks about inclusive service and inclusive design. But I wonder, what do those issues mean to you, and why is it important for consumers?
We're all very excited to see this come out, have to say. Really looking forward to it. What does it mean to me? So I guess really it's about starting with the consumer, starting with the user. I think we often forget when we're designing products, services, regulations, policies, that the people who are the experts are the people affected who are going to use products and services. And I think we fail to put the lived experience of the users and the consumers at the centre of what we do. So many times in product development, we develop things for people like us, and for an average consumer, but there's just no such thing as an average consumer. And when I say an average consumer, I have to mean super consumers, someone who's never ill, always has a steady, reliable income, has loads of time and constant access to the internet to search out the best deals, and also always able to understand reams and reams of terms and conditions. And we all know that's just not a reality. So I guess if you were to say to me, what does inclusive design means in a succinct way, start with the consumer and design out three main things. Those three things being exclusion, inequality, and fairness.
So putting yourself then at the heart of an organisation, then taking those three ideas you talked about there, what are maybe the three main things that organisations can do to make sure that their service is more inclusive?
I'm going to go back over the thing I've just been talking about, which the first thing is just always start with the consumer. And I'm talking about that a lot because it just doesn't happen in policy making, regulatory making, and in product design, I believe. Product and service developers or designers, whatever you want to call them, are not the experts the users are. We have to make a real important, attempt to make sure we reach to people who just aren't like us. So, this is a challenge to BSI too here. I would say don't rely too heavily on consumer representatives like me. We're just one piece of the jigsaw. Your decision makers in any organisation really need to spend time with people not like themselves. So, I don't know, but an example here could be how much time has BSI spent working with people in poverty, for example, in the design of their new inclusive design standard? Maybe a lot, maybe not. But these are the challenges we all have to face constantly. I guess the second thing I'd say here is around, I've heard companies and regulators challenging themselves to recruit more diversely. And I think that's so important because the more diverse a workforce means the more likelihood of inclusivity because more diverse thoughts, diverse opinions and experience drive diverse policy making, product development, etc. And finally, nothing will happen without senior management buy-in, giving staff permission to do things differently. And I do recognise this may mean that it takes more time over the product development process and more resource. But the big win is a larger consumer base for your product, a more useful policy that really meets lots of people's needs rather than the needs of those designing them.
Did you know? Website accessibility.
For most of us, the internet has become part of our everyday lives. Increasingly, some information is available only online and only website customers can benefit, for example from lower product prices. But not everyone can take full advantage of all that the internet has to offer. For the millions of people with disabilities, many websites can be hard to read, understand, or navigate. The standard BS 8878 is designed to help organisations improve their websites, making them easier to use for everyone, including a requirement to seek feedback from website users and test sites to ensure that they stay accessible as technology develops. In this final section, I speak to Caroline Lewis, Director at Access Design Solutions, and an expert in the design of inclusive and accessible environments. She is also a CPIN consumer representative in this area. To kick off our conversation, I asked her about her own standards journey and that CPIN role.
I joined CPIN back in 2016. My co-director that I work with, a lady called Carol Thomas, was involved with CPIN and also the European equivalent, which is ANEC. So she encouraged my application, really. The reason being that for the past probably 20 years, my work, my role is working with consumers, primarily in the built, pedestrian and transport environments areas. So my work really involves there are two sides to this. Working with the end users who would be impacted by, the projects that I'm getting involved in, but then also working with the professionals. When we work with the professionals, we tend to use the standards and guidance to advise them what they need to achieve. So the CPIN membership really was drawing those two aspects together, really. So both the end user and the professionals implementing the standards. So it was a really good fit there. And then since that time, so since joining CPIN, I've really just learnt to consider and represent the wider views of consumers and working with other people on committees, business reps and industry reps and manufacturers. So it's been really interesting.
Take us inside that role a bit, Caroline. What does it involve in being a CPIN rep?
You're part of a network, so you're never alone when you're considering your work in the standards arena. So there's multidisciplinary professionals involved, aiming to really ensure that the consumer voice is heard in standards. CPIN provide a lot of training for us, right from induction stages, and then we have biannual forums, and we all have the opportunity to get together and find out what each other are doing. So you never feel like you're alone. You're part of a team of people who really have the same aims and passion as you do. And then my particular representation at the moment for CPIN is specifically around the design of accessible and inclusive environments, which is kind of my area of specialty. So in that role, I would attend committee meetings. And then when that committee is developing new standards or has task groups on certain particular issues, then you get involved in that and review, comments that people have submitted through consultations, for example. So you also are able to, as well as that specialism, you're also able to input into other standards that other CPIN reps are working on. So I've inputted into, fire risk, or another lady was looking at spectator facilities and needed some input. So really, we all work together. The role of us as a CPIN rep is really to encourage the other committee members that we're sitting with to achieve, those inclusive services that can be used by as many people as possible, really.
So improving accessibility is one way that organisations can help consumers in vulnerable circumstances. I wonder, what are some of the risks facing consumers if buildings aren't accessible? And what can organisations do to make things better?
Yes, so we obviously, quite clearly, we all want to be able to be independent and safe in what we do in our daily lives. And if you don't have those accessible buildings, then it means that certain people aren't able to either access your services or access employment or leisure facilities. And so what we always say is that by making your built environment accessible, then you're going to benefit all consumers. So we talk about inclusive, accessible design, rather than people very narrowly sometimes just thinking of access for disabled people. So, for example, accessible built design helps parents with pushchairs or people with luggage. The advantages are far wider than just disabled people. So, and to really, if people do that, then not only are they meeting, the legislation and the building regulations that we have, which are minimum kind of standards, but there are obviously business advantages to that for them as well. The spending power of all those people that they can get within their business, and also, in terms of employment, the diversity of talent really that they're missing by having that inaccessible building. So there are many advantages to making things more accessible so that people can access your premises.
So can you give us some examples of the sort of influence that CPIN and CPIN reps have had on standards in the area of inclusive accessible design?
Yes, of course. So I mentioned earlier that I sit on one particular committee, British Standards Committee, which looks at the design of accessible environments. And that standard is particularly, we've been involved in the review of that standard, because as I'm sure your listeners will know, every standard goes through a 5-yearly review process. So the last review of that particular standard, which was BS 8300, they decided to split the standard into 2 parts. Internal environments and external environments, and the external environments was really the new part to that standard. So we were involved in a lot of detail in writing that new standard, and in particular we're able to input quite a lot in terms of wayfinding, which is how people orientate and find their way around external environments. And then, as well as the British standards, we're also we've got the benefit of working at a European level and also an international level. So My colleague Carol Thomas that I mentioned earlier was part of a project team of consultants writing the very first European standard in this area. And what that really means is that when public sector bodies procure projects from now on within Europe, they will have to take this standard into account. So really, there's quite a big impact of being able to get involved in these standards. So not only do we benefit working with other countries, but also that, of course, they learn from our experiences, and that certainly helps with developing countries who aren't perhaps as advanced as we are with their standards development work. So
Caroline, is the standard you're referring to there, is that BSEN 17210?
That's right. Yes, it is. And that standard has just received approval. So we now have that as a new British standard and European standard. And there are two what we're calling technical specifications that will come out that are to be read in line with that European standard, which have also received approval, but we're just waiting for publication. So any day now, essentially. So Matthew, I would just really encourage, I've really enjoyed my time and valued being part of that network, the CPIN network, for the past 5 years. So, and we're always keen to get other people involved. So if this sounds like something that you would like to do, then I can certainly encourage that you do that, because it's certainly a worthwhile thing.
My thanks to Julie Hunter, Julie Walker, Martin Coppack and Caroline Lewis for their contributions to this episode. The next episode in this series will look at the issue of consumer safety and how CPIN and standards play a role in protecting consumers by minimising the risk of harm when using products and services. To make sure you don't miss out, subscribe to the BSI Education Podcast now, wherever you get your podcasts.
You have been listening to an episode of the BSI Education Podcast. To find out more, visit bsigroup.com/education.
You just heard a Stripped Media production.